Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Saltzman. There's my background. Welcome to our webinar series, our Fireside Chat. Today, our interviewee is going to be Chris Rotolo. Dr. Rotolo is Vice President of Global Talent Management at MiTek's, which is a Berkshire Hathaway company. He's responsible for the full talent lifecycle, including talent acquisition, onboarding, employee experience, lifelong learning, people analytics, performance management, leadership, organization development, and succession planning. So he's got the whole shebang there. Prior to joining MiTek's, Dr. Rotolo was Vice President of Global Talent Management and Organizational Development at PepsiCo, where his team was responsible for global core HR people processes, including employee surveys, performance management, leadership development, feedback, career development tools, team effectiveness, and early pipeline succession planning. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Jeff. That all sounds great.
That's a mouthful, huh?
It is.
Busy, busy, busy. Before we jump in, let me just do a couple of some housekeeping comments. At the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A little icon. If you have a question you would like to ask Chris, anything that we covered or something you'd like more detail on, just click on that and put your question in the box. And Amanda is going to be monitoring those questions. And we're going to try and leave 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so at the end to respond to as many questions as we can. If not, I'm sure we can follow up with you and respond to your questions offline after we're done. Additionally, at the end of today's session, after a few minutes, you're going to get a survey from us talking about the length of the session today, the topic, and et cetera, et cetera. Please take a moment to fill it out. That feedback is helpful for us in terms of planning out our next series of webinars. So once again, Chris, welcome to the webinar. And should we dive in?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by thanking you for having me on this. The series is fantastic. Can't wait for the next speaker to come on. But I feel honored to even be here. So thank you for having me.
No problem. I think I just stopped sharing my screen for a moment, just so there's more room for us to be on camera. At least that's what I'm hoping you're seeing now. Chris, let me start off. There's probably not a lot of people on the session today that have heard about MiTek's before.
Right.
Can you give us a description of what this company is, how it works, where it's located, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. I didn't know of it until I was recruited for it. But I've come to know it, still learning about it myself, but I've only been there about a year and a half. So MiTek's is in the construction and building industry. We've been around for about 70 years, but in 2001, we were bought by Berkshire Hathaway. So we're a wholly owned subsidiary of Berkshire, which is a little different than what I'm used to too. So we don't have a board of directors. We don't, we're a private company in a sense. We're about 5,500 employees, about 2 to 3 billion in revenue, in over 90 countries. So we're spread out. But what's interesting and what got me interested in this role was it's not just your average building construction company. What we're really doing is transforming the industry. It sounds bold and ambitious, but let me spend a few minutes, if I could, talking about that, just to put everything in context. If you think about how things get built, that really hasn't changed for literally centuries. It's a very cumbersome process. And when you add things like COVID or a global pandemic on top of it, supply chain shortages, timelines have just gone out of whack. The demands, we all have experienced the housing demand over the past couple of years. Labor has gotten hard to come by. let alone just and what that results in, right, in terms of lack of quality and those kinds of things. But when you layer sustainability and all of that on top of it, it's just not the best and optimized way to do things. So about 70 years ago, MiTek was born through this invention of what's called the gang nail plate. So if you look at the roof over your head, odds are there's a gang nail plate that's holding the trusses, the things that hold up the roof together. It's a bunch of sticks with being held by something, and it's this gang nail plate. But what that really set off, and to this day, we still make those. They're highly engineered for the different types of loads and everything that has to go into that design. But if you think about what that did, is all of a sudden you didn't have to be on site to create that roof truss. You could do something off-site, bring that truss that's to spec to the job site and put it up much quicker. So it kind of set off this whole thing that's called design, make, and build, which is you design everything to spec using the architect and the general contractor and the component manufacturers, anybody involved in that the whole stream up front, agreeing how everything is going to be together. And we have, a bunch of software to support that. We even have virtual reality. You can tour, see through walls, all that sort of stuff. Then our big emphasis is on the make stage, which ideally is what we call offsite building. The idea to do offsite, if you think about the advantages of it, you end up getting better quality because you've got the talent doing the right work in the right way, in the right place. You do it faster, and quite often it's less money too, or at least more value. The extreme example is there's a hotel in Midtown Manhattan where the hotel rooms were built in Poland. They were brought over, everything from the sheets and the linens and towels in that room, and then the high rise was built in like 2 to 3 weeks time. And that's an extreme example. And modular isn't anything new, but a lot of the intricacies and the barriers that have facilitated commercial module we're working through. But we're into these spaces now, like floor trusses, where instead of building, the subflooring and the floors, and then you've got things supporting it, we're building the whole vertical, and everything can go together. So, we're basically a enabling organization for the construction industry, really trying to transform how that whole industry is building today.
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask you then if you feel pressure to transform talent management in the same way these guys are transforming construction. But I understand, though, before we get into that, I understand you were the first IO hired in this company. So you're walking in and basically had a blank slate, right?
Yes.
So how did you figure out where to start? What was your how'd you come up with a priority of, can't do everything all at once, so we're going to start improving things by doing A and then B and then C. How did you figure all that out?
Well, that's really what attracted me to the role, for sure, is just this opportunity to kind of think through that whole thought process. So it's kind of the IO equivalent of a, kid in a candy store, right? Mm-hmm. And I totally recognize that people listening in maybe not have that opportunity, but if you had to step back, it's probably not too hard. The way I thought about it, and this was an interview question asked of me, as I was being interviewed for the role, was kind of 3 stages. Number 1, set up the infrastructure, right? They didn't even have a job architecture. So, or, different roles were, had different titles, or similar roles had different titles, and so on and so forth. Luckily, that wasn't in my spec to set up that whole job architecture, but I couldn't go forward with some things until that architecture was in place. give you an example, a talent segregation or differentiation, right? A high potential identification. You can't use what's typically a 2-level jump because you have no levels, right? So it had to wait for a few things to get into place, but that infrastructure I saw as, number one, aside from the job architecture, performance management, really getting some disciplined processes in place for managing performance, uh, leadership competencies or some sort of competency framework that can be the center of your integrated talent framework. And then the idea of talent differentiation, we're still working through that, but the company really hadn't thought about applying different resources to different people in the company based on, the promise that they have. So that was kind of the first phase, if you will, that I thought about. The second was, you could call it, thinking about the culture or, the wrapper around that infrastructure. So starting talent development and the whole future proofing of the organization, including leadership capability, assessment and feedback, including 360 feedback, and culture and engagement and a whole listening strategy. That was kind of the second phase. And then the last phase is the whole employee experience. And really, now that you've got some of those elements in place, kind of smoothing all of that out, including onboarding, career development resources, recognition program. So that's kind of how I thought about it, was like, what's the skeleton and then the muscles and then the skin around it.
Were you also like, when you started with performance management, was that because you thought that might have the biggest like return on investment or was it more like that's a fundamental that I need to be able to build everything else off of?
Probably more the latter. I've never been asked, knock on wood, kind of to establish an ROI of anything that I'm doing. I'm blessed that our leadership feels like this is such an important space that investment in our people isn't really questioned that much. But there was a feeling of, or a desire to be able to reward good performance. And it was very much subjective and sporadic when I came in.
Got it. So as the first sort of IO in a company, did the management team have a sense of sort of the support, the infrastructure, the staffing you would need in order to pull off all the activities you were just describing? Or did you have to say, I can't do this all by myself. I need XYZ, right?
Yeah, a little of both. So when I was contemplating coming into the role, I had a conversation around growing the team, got very good support there. And just to give you an example, I came in with, I think 2 people were on my team, and I've grown it to about 12, which is great.
And that's in a year and a half, you said, right?
Yeah, in a year and a half.
That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really good, and there's recognition that we need to keep going a little bit if we want to reach some of these other goals. But in addition, our CEO, I think I had been there maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and he had such conviction around talent development. He essentially said, not in these words, but almost exact, like, I don't care what it takes. You do the best in class. So I don't care how much it costs or how many people you need. Just do it.
Well, that's a nice thing to hear.
Yeah.
So was this the impetus for bringing you in and the expansion? Was this because the business was growing, or was it transforming, or why now? I mean, 70-year-old company. Why now?
Yeah, it really was part of that whole business transformation story. So our CEO, he's been in role now almost 7 years, but you got to kind of take 2 years away from because of COVID, where everything kind of locked down, and we're highly dependent on kind of housing starts and commercial that's going. So what he came in to really transform the company towards this more offsite building concept. Its bread and butter is making these engineered products, these gang nail plates and connector plates and those kinds of things, and it's very profitable. It's a very solid business, as has been the case, but going into this other direction is going to open up more revenue streams, more innovations. And he knew that to do that, we can't do HR in the same way. So he brought in a new CHRO about a year before me, who then also knew that she couldn't just continue to think about HR in a traditional way. So she brought me in, and the domino effect after that.
Well, so there's the beefing up then of talent management and HR is to position the company for where it wants to go in the future.
Absolutely.
Right? And not to address maybe to address current issues as well, but really they had their eye on the future. Yeah. And to say, in order to get there, we need more robust systems.
When I was doing my meet and greets with the senior team, almost to a T, every single one of them said, we've been successful despite ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? So there's like a recognition of, that they need to do something different. They don't know how they've been so successful in the past. But yeah, it certainly got me thinking as an IO, like, do you really need us? Right? You've been that successful, but to really shift the company trajectory, yeah, absolutely. You need some innovative thinking there.
And as you're describing it, something that comes to my mind is, how, in the United States, we went from phones using copper wires to cell phones that, just counted on towers, right? And in some parts of the developing world, they skipped the copper phase completely. They went right to the cell tower. Because why put in the copper? It's very expensive and so forth if you just put the towers. Is there any kind of analogies like that to what you've been doing in terms of the crawl, walk, run kind of thing?
Yeah.
Have you been able to go directly to run in terms of your talent management activities, or is it required to first crawl before you run in talent management?
I'll give the good IO answers. It depends, right? Uh-huh. But so I've got an example of both where you can't run before you crawl, and an example where I think you can run. The example where you can is development and training and learning. That space was pretty haphazard prior to me coming on board. As far as I could tell, there was a little bit of a learning management system with some training offerings, and you could go in and, with your manager approval, sign up and take a course or this or that. There was some mandatory training that you had to take. I advocated to bring in a learning experience platform, which was very focused on skills and not so much the learning or the activity that you're doing to gain those skills, which to me is that cell phone tower, because when it's a skill economy and you create that whole talent marketplace idea, then you're really, accelerating the whole talent space tenfold, in my opinion. So we were able to do that. We haven't turned on all of the features and functions of the LXP just yet. But where I found that you can't is in the leadership competencies. So, coming from PepsiCo, I started to formulate a model with kind of the maturity and the thinking in the leadership space that PepsiCo had, right? And as I was doing my research, initial research for the model, and formulated some draft thinking around the competencies, the reaction I got from the leaders was like, this is way too sophisticated. What about delegation? What about decision making and things? So I had to kind of pull it back a little bit and meet them where they're at and where their needs were.
So is it fair to say where you were able to go to the cell tower mode is in the technology spaces, but in terms of developing people, people can't become cell towers overnight. They need to first be copper lines.
Yeah,
and slowly
that's a
develop
fair
skills.
statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you can accelerate the advancement through the stages, but they might still have to go through certain stages. Maybe that's fair.
And is the emphasis on developing internal people, or are you also looking to bring in certain talents that maybe the organization hasn't had before?
It's a little of both. Yeah,
Both.
we're hiring externally a lot of technology development, software developers. There's some really niche areas that we look for. At the same time, there's a lot of individuals who've been there for 20, 30 years with such deep construction building expertise that's hard to replace.
Yeah. The example of sort of slowly bringing leadership competencies along reminds me of a steel mill where I did a survey once, and I was giving feedback to the supervisors. And as I'm giving the feedback, one of the supervisors jumped up and screaming at me and says, "I haven't talked to my people in 30 years. I'm not about to start now." I'm like, okay, let's take it back to some more basic stuff then.
You don't have to talk to people. Right? Yeah.
Right. And what you find is, right, the people who are most interested are in improving whether it's a leadership skills and so forth, are probably the ones that are least in need, because they're always trying to better themselves. And the ones who don't want anything to do with it, they're the ones who probably need the most help.
Well, just a really recent example of that. So we this past year we rolled out, talking about kind of cell towers and copper lines. We rolled out some leadership training and management training to all people leaders in the organization. Some of it was very foundational, but others it was a little bit more advanced. And there was a big expectation. It wasn't mandated, but it was expected that you would get through this training. And then we also this fall ran an employee survey, engagement survey, pretty typical type content. And we looked at not only the engagement, but also just their attitudes towards their manager, attitudes towards, the work climate, et cetera. And then correlated it with whether their manager completed that training or didn't. And as you would expect, right, the people who had managers who had completed the training, or at least partially completed the training, much higher scores almost across the board. And of course, it kind of doesn't matter whether it was due to the training or not, to your point. But it was kind of a neat correlation to look at.
The chicken or the egg, right?
Yeah.
You never know. So with all this stuff going on, right, what are the kinds of things that either you or your management team are monitoring to say, this stuff's working as it should be working, or here are things we need to tweak in a different way? How do you know whether it's management competencies, whether it's performance management, or one of the other things you mentioned? How do you know, in your mind, this is doing what, you have lofty goals, right? How do you know that you're achieving those goals?
Well, I think, part of the answer is educating my leadership too, because, some of them are very traditional. If you think building construction industry is not cutting edge, from a talent standpoint, you wouldn't be completely wrong. There's some really innovative leaders in the company, but a lot of them also have very traditional thoughts around HR, personnel, and that kind of thing. So their ideas,
they still call it personnel, right?
No, some of them maybe. I don't know. I won't put anyone on the spot, but
okay.
But so some of their kind of metrics might be just how many people have completed the training. right? It's as simple as that. Are they participating in XYZ? So I'm not getting kind of huge asks from that standpoint around your question. So we're starting to look at questions like I just shared, like, well, how do we know if this training is actually working? Maybe we can look at engagement, but yeah, maybe it just is based on people who are, good managers, and they'll do the training, but they'll also have engaged employees. So it's a good question. I don't have a good answer to, because our engagement scores are pretty good too. There's not glaring needs around certain things that we have to address. So some of it, in my opinion, is doing what we think is the right thing to do and standing up some of this infrastructure. And then as we get more engagement, as we see some type of business effect that we'll have to think through and what that looks like. We're not like a Walmart that has hundreds of stores, thousands of stores, where we can do some sort of linkage analysis, as you guys would know more than me about that. So it's a good question. I'll leave it at that.
And you mentioned you're in a number of countries. And so when you're building these systems, are you trying to roll them out globally across these countries, or do you find that you need to modify it country by country, which would assume would add complexity to the nth degree there?
It does. It's a both and answer. So we have over 2,000 people in Vietnam, and it's mostly our professional services business, where most of them are doing architectural designs for builders. So builders will contract us to do their design, like Pulte homes, or those big builders. And so they have this machine going where they pull people from school, they teach them English, they teach them design and drawing, all the way to kind of Western design, because they're not familiar with having a bathroom in the house kind of thing, right? So a lot of education. They have this whole apprenticeship program bringing them through. So that's a very different approach to talent when it comes to even talent management and rewards, that kind of thing. There's some pockets where we have to do a little bit of differentiation. The biggest thing is languages, to be quite honest, right? Like, how do you have a robust library of learning and development that's in every language that
in all these languages? Yeah. But as you describe that, like having essentially draftsmen, architects in Vietnam, and what you have to do to create that talent set, there must be a culture in the organization then of, you're not satisfied with simply who you select, but you're going to develop them over time because of the experiences in Vietnam. Certainly that seems to be part of the company culture. So does that hold true with sort of management skill sets as well, or is it just the technical operations?
I think it's true for the most part. We're really just getting started in that regard, but I think there is a spirit, at least, that we want to build even more than it might be today, where we can have people come in and grow themselves into leadership roles if they so aspire. Give them the capabilities and the education. But we're just this year, we've started adding some transition programs for leadership. So as you become a first-time manager, you go through a 4-day program to really learn the ropes on how to do that, and so on and so forth. So long ways to go on it, but yeah, that's the goal, I would say.
That sounds great. So if you think of where you are on your sort of talent management journey, what do you think is going to happen over the next 3, 4, 5 years in terms of where you want to go, or how are you lining up the future of talent management at MiTek?
Yeah. Well, we're we have been going a little slower on things like I'll take that learning and development space as an example. So just getting people familiar with kind of the skill economy aspect, or thinking about themselves as a skill profile, was kind of the first step that we've been taking this year. So getting people in, creating a skill profile, having them rate their skills with their manager. That, if you think about it, not only helps that individual identify what their skill gaps are, but it gives us, the organization, a view of the entire organization of where we have a skill abundance and a skill deficiency. So fantastic view from that perspective. But then next year, our plan is to turn on what we call the opportunity marketplace, where now we've got every role in the organization mapped by skill. So you now, as a team member, could match yourself against any role in the company, know if you have aspiration to reach a certain role, what skills that you need to go after to fill those gaps. We'll then turn on some aspects of this, like a gig economy or short-term project assignments, because it's a small company. You may not be able to move into all these different roles, and you want to gain experiences. So why not break that down into smaller building blocks with short-term assignments or projects and things like that? So there's a pretty robust roadmap in that side of things. I could take any one of the whole talent life cycle and take that map.
So is the idea, though, that the individual employee sees the map and takes the initiative to take what other path, or does the company look at the skill sets it needs and reaches into the employee population and says, we need you to develop this way? So is it a pull or is it a push, or both?
It's both. Yeah. So I know you had Alan Church on there, and I was anointed in the church of Alan Church. So I subscribe to you give the tools to the masses to develop their own career, but for the small cohort of people that you think you really should invest in, you kind of white glove and handhold them. But all that's to say too that with this whole approach, if you as a leader in the organization are seeing a set of skills that the organization is going to need because of its strategy 3-5 years down the road, you can start inserting it today to try to build instead of having to go out and buy. HR is notorious for being late to the game on anticipating things that
skill sets,
org strategy needs. Right.
Yeah. So when you say, if you see skills needed 3, 4, 5 years down the road, what are your monitors? How are you saying, we're going to need someone who can do X, Y, Z? How are you keeping yourself tied close to that? Are you interviewing managers? Are you looking at industry? What do you do?
All of that, plus just this year, we've started to stand up as a business this long-term strategic planning process. So there's a business plan that's kind of 5-10 years out. Then there's a strategic plan that's linked to it that's 3 to 5 years, and then kind of our annual plan, and they're all linked together. So I'm plugged into that process, and we look at that to say, okay, if our plan is to go down this road 5 years away, what's the translation in terms of skills and leadership capability that we need?
The talents that you need.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat of a guess, right? Because the environment impinges like COVID. Right?
Exactly.
Which no one could have predicted.
Yeah.
Or maybe they could have. Hard to say. And it sounds like also that in terms of you keeping your senior management engaged in your work, that sounds like it's a given. It doesn't sound like it's something you have to work at very hard.
I was fortunate enough not to have to. There was a couple things that happened too that I thought were helpful. So when I first came on board, the CEO asked me to, because he had also just reorganized the company. So he had a brand new leadership team, expanded leadership team, about 20 people or so. And he asked me to help do some team building of that team, and made me part of that leadership team. So I was able to get to know them first and foremost, but also share kind of this roadmap that I've shared with you, and use them as a sounding board and a governance in some ways. So, they gave me feedback on the leadership competencies, et cetera. So very supportive to begin with, but then keeping them informed, consulted. It was superior, just fantastic. Yeah.
And as the first sort of IO in the company, did you have to say, this is what IO is, and here's what I can do, and let's chart this path together, kind of thing? Or were they familiar with it already?
We haven't really emphasized our field, but what we've had to do is kind of say, this is what a competency model is, right? This is some options around performance management and how you do that well, and even things like linking performance with pay. So some of those kind of basic concepts of IO we've had to educate for sure. But I've always kind of felt that our field, the best thing is for people to discover our field, right? And they'll say, "Oh, you can do that really well. Can you do this as well?" Right?
Right.
And then it just snowballs from there.
Right. That's interesting. So, Chris, over the years, you've worked in a lot of different areas, from selection to surveys to talent management, and on and on and on. If you take a step back, and some of the folks listening today are sort of earlier mid-career kinds of people. What advice, and I know you've also been active in terms of publishing and PsyOp and things like that. Do you have any career advice? Like, how important was it for you to be sort of publishing or doing, and you're also adjunct, I believe, right?
Yes.
At NYU?
NYU.
And how important is that kind of stuff to what you do in sort of the private sector? And what advice can you give people about whether they should undertake sort of all these different streams?
Yeah, you're catching me at a time where I don't know if I would advise that, because there's a lot of grading on my plate right now.
A lot of grading right now.
Yeah.
Right.
But no, that was something I always personally aspired to do. And so, teaching and even just public speaking, I just wanted to be good at it, and I'm still working at it. And so, and then I think the same with publishing too. I've always wanted to be able to do it. It's hard to crack into. As I said, Alan Church was kind enough to pull me into a lot, and that got me started and doing a lot of writing and publishing. If it's not up your alley, I don't think it's really required to have a successful career. What I do like about it is that it keeps me personally focused and balanced on the science and the practice, which helps. So, when I'm teaching, I can bring in my experiences at work into the classroom, and then, any articles I'm reading or research that I find, I can bring into the work. So I think it's beneficial, but is it critical? Not necessarily. I think that the key and the best career advice I give to earlier career people is just be a sponge. I meet so many students who say, I want to go into OD, and that's all I want to do is like org change. And I kind of say, okay, but think about it from an organization perspective. They have this huge org change initiative that's multi-million dollars at stake. Do they really want to hire somebody fresh out of their master's program to run this change initiative, right? There's some things that
Mhm.
kind of you need to build up to. And what's better is just treat everything as an experience and just soak it up, because that's whether you end up doing OD, every other experience is going to help inform that.
Mhm.
So yeah, the best advice I have is just work towards that goal, but also don't shut out opportunities right at your foot.
And you've spent time both as an internal person and as a consultant. Would you recommend sort of seeing both sides of that stream, or you think it's
Yeah.
fine just being an internal person, or is it fine just being a consultant?
I think working externally, it it teaches you that client focus, and that urgency that you need to serve clients. So when you go internally, that stays with you. You know, you may not be working as much of a breadth of opportunities or projects that you have as when you're external. Um, but I think it helps. And then when going the other way, you know, being internal gives you that bigger, broader perspective of the whole ecosystem of the organization. So that
Mhm.
when you're consulting externally on a single project, you still can apply that bigger picture to help that client. Um, but yeah, I worked for you, Jeff, prior to
Right.
OV and your prior organization. Um, you know, that taught me like how to work with these very large clients, and manage multiple projects at the same time while serving their, you know, urgent needs, and keeping them happy and satisfied and adding value to their plate.
That's great. Let me going back to the sort of the publishing and the teaching and so forth. Um, is your management team one aware that you do that kind of stuff? And do you think it helps you with them in terms of this guy wrote about it, so he must know what he's talking about? Does any of that kind of stuff happen?
It probably does. I do let them know, but what's interesting is because I've been teaching now, this is my 20th year, believe it or not. It's crazy to think about. And I've never really asked permission.
Right.
I just, you know,
Just do it.
partly is, yeah, I just kind of done it. At least at NYU, you know, the courses are at night. It's one night a week for one semester. So it's not hugely in the way of work. I've never done anything that just gets in the way of work. If it did, I certainly would ask permission. Um, does it add credibility? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not doing it for that purpose. It
Mhm.
might.
Yep.
Um, I'd say the vast majority in this new role don't even know that I do.
And-
Um, but yeah, in prior roles, I think it has helped.
and That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, Amanda, are you there monitoring questions? I think we have quite a few of them that have come in, right?
I am here, and yes, we do. So happy
Should
to
we
turn
take a
to
few
them now.
minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have two questions that are somewhat related. So I'm going to read both of them and maybe you can answer them at the same time. The first one says, in building out the 3 stages of work at MiTek, how much did you rely on vendors versus building things in-house? For example, building the performance management platform process, developing competencies, creating talent development efforts.
Yeah.
And the second question says, for your programs, for example, the new leader program, are you developing content in-house or contracting/licensing that out? And can you recommend any firms?
um, so the answer is both, um, or it depends. For example, with those transition programs, we did leverage an outside vendor. Um, I don't know if it's okay to mention who those are, who those are.
Hey, go ahead.
Um, um, you know, this one's called Leadership Pipeline Institute. So, you know, if you remember the Ram Charan
Yeah.
book on leadership pipeline, you know, one of the co-authors created this consulting firm that creates or offers these transition programs, and they are very good. They are intense. And so short-term view is that's what we'll leverage because it's a turnkey. You just assign people to these programs, and they are live, in person or virtual, but they're live. Long term, maybe we do pull that in house. We get it being in house, we get to do it kind of our way and add a little bit of our own personal flavor to it. We could offer it probably more often than what we can now. But that's a longer term thing.
They're not industry specific, are they?
No,
it's just general.
Yeah. Other things, we're doing ourselves, like the leadership competencies. We felt like that was something that we need to create. Senior leadership has to play a heavy hand in it. 360, on the other hand, in the deployment of that tool, we are deploying, or we are using an outside vendor. I don't know if I can say, but we're using OV for that. So
that one you certainly can say.
I figured. Yeah. So it's a little bit of both. Where we can ramp up really quickly by bringing in an outside vendor, absolutely. Whether or not some things will stay that way will depend on whether it's really important to.
Bringing in the outside vendor is a little bit like going to the cell tower stage immediately, right?
Yeah.
Because somebody's already developed that latest technology and you're really taking advantage of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. A few other questions here. What are your thoughts on skills versus competencies? When selecting, evaluating, and developing employees, where do we see greater value? And when looking long term, do skills or competencies take priority?
Yeah, so just to level set, I see skills as kind of more granular than competencies. Competencies are at a more aggregate level of knowledge, skills, abilities, and maybe other characteristics too, right? So a lot of the vendors, LXP, learning experience platforms, and other things mostly are focused on skills, with some capability to address competencies. And so we know that we're going to have to do some crosswalking of competencies and skills. And so I think it kind of depends on what you're looking at too. So I think to answer the question directly, I think having the granularity of skills is very helpful when it comes to development, and maybe even, talent assessment and identification and hiring too. Competencies is helpful almost from like a marketing standpoint when you're talking to the company about what leadership should look like, right? What good leadership could look like. If you're talking in language of skills, that might be a really long list, but competencies you can shorten to, 7 plus or minus 2, right?
Right. And of course, when you're doing a 360 or performance management, whatever, you want to drill it down to behaviors that are observable.
Yes.
Right. So
yeah, even underneath all of that, right? To really get into the observable pieces for feedback, et cetera.
Okay, Amanda, what's next?
Thank you. Yep. Hi, Chris. Super inspiring. Thank you. Speaking of leadership models, in your experience, what would be the communication and adoption milestones?
Say that one more time, Amanda. I'm sorry.
Speaking of leadership models, in your experience, what would be the communication and adoption milestones?
Gotcha. Really good question. So I'm speaking from when leadership model, it might be brand new to the organization. One of the things that we are doing is tying it to the vision and mission of the organization. So there is an effort underway right now to kind of reignite that vision and mission so that people understand where MiTek is going in the future. And then the chapter 2 that we want to do is to unveil this leadership. We're calling it leadership blueprint, of course. This leadership blueprint to say, okay, if this is our vision and mission, this is how leadership ties to that. It's going to get us there. So tying it to the strategy, I think is one thing. You have to also decide whether that model is truly just going to be for leadership, right? And above a certain level in the organization, or whether you're going to say this leadership model is for all employees, including individual contributors. And the messaging is different depending on that, where you go on that, right? And the role of competencies versus values is very important to consider too. You think of like Amazon, and they have, I think it's 14 leadership principles, they call them, but they're really their values, they're what they hire upon, what they evaluate people upon, et cetera. We've stepped a little back from that and say this goes to all employees, because even if you're an individual contributor, you lead people in some way, shape, or form. But this is what good leaders do, and we have our kind of our values as a separate framework. So I didn't totally address all of your question, but hopefully I gave you a little flavor.
Has I'm sure COVID has been very disruptive to the building side. Has COVID slowed down or has changed the implementation, like the milestones in the question? Are you stretching things out because of COVID, or are you trying to work around it?
Well, actually, I don't know how much this was COVID or not, but the impact of the past year and a half, we actually had more demand than we had supply for our products, because steel costs, supply chain, et cetera. So that was crazy. But we've had record-breaking years for the past, I can't even tell you how many years. We do see in the next year ahead, at least, a little bit of a softening in the housing market. We're not just in residential, we're in commercial as well. But has it slowed? I don't think it's slowed too much of our plans. If anything, what we're trying to do is have the right cadence of things coming out. So we're not overwhelming our team members, but also that we're building upon other things that are coming out. So, like when should recognition come out? Should it be prior to, this relaunch of our values or guiding principles, et cetera? So it's more that than it is kind of the business results.
Got it.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Chris, when you look into what is the right thing to do, how much do you take into account benchmarking data? For example, best practices and what other organizations are doing, et cetera?
That's a really good question, and a question we got directly from our CEO not too long ago too, around some of our survey data. I think it's, from a best practice, it's always good to know what other companies are doing and just to be aware of what good looks like. I mean, if you all go to the PSYOP conference, I mean, one of the things that practitioners love to do is sit in presentations from other companies just to see what's going on. Does that mean that you can just totally lift and shift? Probably not. You've got to do some tailoring to your own situation. So I think it's always good to have that perspective, but not to just totally blindly adopt things, and conversely, not to just sit with blinders on and not care about other companies and how they're approaching things.
Yeah, that reminds me of a sort of discussion Scott Brooks and I have all the time. And it's, as you're trying to differentiate yourself from the competition, you want to be strategically different from the competition. And so if all you're doing is duplicating what the competition is doing, you're becoming more and more like the
Like that.
competition,
Yeah.
and you may lose a little bit of your edge
Sure.
of, here's how we differentiate, right?
Yep.
So it's great to know what the competition is doing, but rather than this lift and shift, it's really how are we going to differentiate ourselves
Yeah.
from the competition, right?
Well, and you really can't unless you know what they're doing, right?
Right,
So,
right. Exactly. Okay,
All right,
one
do we
more,
have time for
Amanda,
one
or are we
last
out of time?
question? Maybe there's just one last question. Someone wants to know, how influential is having a PhD? As someone with their master's in IO, I've received some pushback when recommending initiatives, and I'm wondering if having a PhD may help.
That's a perennial question that even when I was going through grad school, people were asking. I think if you're working with other PhDs, they probably would push back, right? You just have your master's. If you're not, working with other PhDs, then you're probably a very well-respected member of the team. You've most likely even been more educated than others on that team. At the same time, experience weighs a lot more as you go through your career than the degree that you got 20 years ago. So over time, I think it lessens as a key differentiator, particularly for practitioners. So that said, if you aspire to ever do a PhD, I advocate for it. I think it's a great learning. Is it mandatory? Absolutely not. I know many smarter master's level IOs than some of the PhDs out there. It's not a magic wand there.
And just to chime in on that one, I have a master's.
Yes, Jeff is a good example.
And I've done okay over the years.
Yes.
So
started a few companies, and
don't think that the PhD is a necessary requirement to be successful in the field. You can get pretty far with the master's.
Absolutely.
Okay, let me screen share one more time, because we have one more of these sessions coming up with Dell Technologies on November 10th, and it's not too late to sign up for that one. And this is about how Dell creates their research strategy, which will be, the interview will be conducted by Victoria Hendrickson from our staff. So if you'd like to listen in on that one, there's still time to register for that one. And with that, Chris, let me give you a chance. Any closing pearls of wisdom that you'd like to leave with people?
Oh my gosh, just keep advocating for IO psychology if you're into our field. We need the visibility. People need to know what we are and who we are and what we do, because I think it's just a fantastic area. Never worked a day in my life. So thank you, Jeff, for having me on, and Amanda for arranging this.
No problem. Thank you very much for being willing to share your wisdom with the crowd today. And with that, thanks everybody, and hope you'll come to our next session next week. We'll see ya.